The envelope trembled in Harold's weathered hands, blue company letterhead blurring as tears welled unexpectedly. 63 years old and crying at his kitchen table. What would Martha think? The ticking grandfather clock, wedding gift from his father, marked each moment as reality settled in. After 40 years building Patterson Manufacturing from struggling workshop to industry leader, his signature had been forged on transfer documents, his ownership quietly stolen by his own nephew. Coffee cooled beside family photos from happier times, company picnics, award ceremonies, the day they'd broken ground on the new facility. Harold's fingers traced his late wife's smile in the faded image, a sob catching in his throat as he whispered, "What would you tell me to do now, darlin'?" Has someone you trusted betrayed you when you least expected it? Share your story below, like if Harold's pain resonates with you, or follow to discover how he fights back. Has betrayal by family ever left you feeling this helpless? Share your experience in the comments, like if Harold's heartbreak mirrors your own, and follow to see how decades of wisdom become his most powerful weapon against those who underestimated him. John Harmon's hands trembled as he held the letter, company letterhead blurring beneath unexpected tears. 68 years old and crying at his desk. What had he come to? The den's familiar creaking floorboards, usually a comfort in the home he'd built with his own hands 40 years ago, now seemed to mock his vulnerability. Outside, evening settled across the valley. Inside, dust motes danced in the last golden rays filtering through lace curtains Martha had hung before cancer took her 3 years back. The grandfather clock in the hallway, wedding gift from his father, ticked away the seconds as reality settled into his bones. "Can't be right," he whispered, voice catching on the words. "Not from Thomas. Not my own nephew." John reached for his coffee, gone cold during the hour he'd spent reviewing the quarterly statements from Harmon Automotive, the repair shop he'd built from nothing into the most trusted garage in 3 counties. His fingers left smudges on the white ceramic, trembling just as they had that morning when Thomas had handed him the folder with a smile that now seemed false as a $2 watch. The pages spread before him told a story in numbers that didn't add up. Parts ordered but never received. Labor hours billed to loyal customers at rates far above what John had approved. A second business account he'd never authorized, with his signature perfectly forged at the bottom of the establishment documents. A photograph on the bookshelf caught his eye. Last summer's company picnic, his arm around Thomas's shoulders, both smiling wide under the banner celebrating Harmon Automotive's 35th anniversary. Beside it stood photos of his grandchildren working on their first engines under his patient guidance. The legacy he'd built, the trust he'd given. The sob came from somewhere deep, a place John hadn't visited since standing at Martha's grave. It broke free despite his efforts, shoulders shaking as he pressed one weathered hand to his chest. "What would you tell me to do now, darlin'?" he asked the empty room, eyes finding Martha's portrait on the wall. 30 years in the Marines, followed by 3 decades running his business, had taught John to face problems head-on. But this betrayal cut beneath his armor to the soft place where family lived. Tears fell. Paper crinkled in his tightening grip. The clock ticked. Taking a deep breath, John wiped his eyes with his handkerchief, a Father's Day gift embroidered with his initials. The motion left a smear across the paper, revealing something he'd missed before, a slight discoloration in the ink of his supposed signature. Years of checking work orders and examining engine parts for flaws had trained his eye to spot inconsistencies. He leaned closer, mechanic's instincts kicking in. The signature looked perfect at first glance, but the ink density changed midway through, as if the pen had been lifted and replaced, or as if someone had traced over an existing signature and then continued it. John's breath steadied as suspicion replaced shock. The old familiar feeling of a problem needing solving settled over him, a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. A sharp knock at the front door startled him from his thoughts. The clock showed just past 8, too late for casual visitors. John folded the papers carefully, sliding them into his desk drawer. The tears had dried on his cheeks, leaving salty tracks he didn't bother to hide. Who would come calling at this hour? Friend or someone involved in whatever Thomas had done? His steps faltered as he moved toward the sound, mechanic's hands now steady with purpose. John paused in the hallway, hand hesitating on the light switch. Another knock, more insistent this time. Through the frosted glass, a tall silhouette shifted impatiently. He squared his shoulders, old military habits returning as he prepared to face whoever waited. "Coming," he called, voice steadier than he felt. The door swung open to reveal Mike Donnelly, his shop foreman of 20 years. The younger man's face, usually split by an easy grin beneath his salt and pepper mustache, now wore lines of concern. "Evening, John. Sorry to bother you at home, but—" Mike removed his ever-present Harman automotive cap, twisting it in calloused hands. "Something didn't sit right with me after the meeting today. Thought maybe we should talk." Relief and wariness battled in John's chest. He stepped back, gesturing Mike inside. "Coffee's cold, but I can put on a fresh pot. Don't trouble yourself. Won't stay long." Mike followed him into the kitchen anyway, his heavy work boots echoing on the hardwood. "Martha's flower's still going strong," he noted, nodding toward the window where her prized roses climbed trellises John had built the spring before she fell ill. John's throat tightened at the mention of his late wife. "She'd have been after me if they weren't," he managed, reaching for the coffee pot more to hide his face than from any real hospitality. "What's on your mind, Mike?" In the quiet kitchen, with only the refrigerator's hum and distant clock ticking, Mike's next words fell like wrenches on concrete. "Thomas had me sign off on parts orders today. Triple our usual quantities from Jensen Supply. When I questioned it, he said you'd approved expanding inventory." Mike's eyes, sharp from decades of diagnosing engine troubles, fixed on John. "But last week you told me we were keeping inventory tight through winter." The coffee pot slipped in John's grip, nearly crashing to the counter. First the account, now this. How deep does it go? "You did right coming here," John said, abandoning any pretense of coffee making. He retrieved the papers from his den, spreading them across the kitchen table where 30 years of family dinners had taken place, where Thomas had sat countless Sundays, eating Martha's pot roast, telling her stories that made her laugh when the chemo had stolen her appetite. Mike whistled low as John explained what he'd found. "Never thought Thomas would—" He stopped himself. "Sorry, John. He's your blood, not my place." "Blood doesn't excuse betrayal," John said, the words tasting bitter. He thought of Thomas as a boy, following him around the shop, eager to learn every tool's purpose. When had greed replaced that earnestness? Leaning back in his chair, John rubbed his eyes, suddenly bone-weary. "Question is, what else don't I know?" Mike's calloused finger tapped one of the documents. "These supplier codes don't match our system. Almost like he's setting up a parallel business," John finished, the final piece clicking into place. The cold feeling in his stomach spread. "Using my reputation, my contacts, my damn signature." A message alert sounded from John's phone. Thomas's name flashed on the screen. "Need to access the safe deposit box tomorrow. Routine paperwork, nothing urgent." John's jaw tightened. The safe deposit box contained the original deed to the property, business insurance policies, and Martha's will. Nothing routine about any of it. "What will you do?" Mike asked quietly. John stared at the message, decades of discipline battling the urge to confront Thomas immediately. "First, I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with," he said, reaching for his phone. "And who else might be involved?" Outside, wind rustled through Martha's roses, their shadows dancing across the kitchen wall like beckoning fingers. Dawn found John already at his desk, sleep having eluded him after Mike's departure. Coffee steam rose in the gray morning light as he methodically sorted through years of business records, searching for the moment his nephew's betrayal had begun. Outside, frost glazed Martha's rose garden, the November chill painting each thorn and leaf with delicate white. John paused at the window, remembering how she'd loved this time of year, the garden preparing for winter rest, she'd called it. Everything needs time to gather strength, she'd say, patting his hand. Even the strongest things. His reflection stared back at him, deeper lines around his eyes than yesterday, as if the discovery had aged him overnight. The man in the glass looked suddenly older than his 68 years. The phone call to Thomas had been brief. Yes, John would meet him at the bank at 10. No, he couldn't discuss why over the phone. Thomas's voice had held a note of tension John might have missed if he hadn't been listening for it. Turning back to his desk, John opened the bottom drawer where he kept important documents. Behind his military discharge papers and Martha's medical records lay a thin manila folder, untouched for nearly 5 years. He drew it out slowly, feeling its weight in more than just paper. Should have done this when she first suggested it, he murmured to the empty room. The folder contained contingency plans Martha had insisted they create when Thomas joined the business. Alternate signing authorities, backup succession plans, and most importantly, an audit procedure to be triggered if John ever suspected financial irregularities. Martha, ever practical even while fighting cancer, had seen the need for safeguards John had dismissed as unnecessary for family. She always could see clearer than me. Even with what was right under my nose. His hands trembled again, but not from shock this time. The bitter sting of betrayal was crystallizing into something harder, more focused. Righteous anger burned away the last of his tears as he dialed a number written in Martha's neat handwriting. "Catherine Walsh, please," he said when the receptionist answered. "Tell her it's John Harmon, about the lockbox protocol." While waiting, John's gaze fell on a framed photo of Thomas graduating college, the first in their family to do so, wearing the watch John had given him as a gift. The memory of his pride that day twisted like a knife. Catherine came on the line, her voice bringing him back to the present. "John, it's been years." "Too long," he agreed, the familiar cadence of their old friendship momentarily softening his voice. "I need to activate the procedure Martha set up." A pause. "I see. No questions. No surprise." Catherine had been Martha's attorney and friend long enough to understand the significance. "You're certain?" John's eyes hardened as he looked again at the forged signature. "Completely." They spoke for 10 minutes, Catherine's professional tone never wavering as she outlined the next steps. When John hung up, a strange calm had settled over him, the same feeling he'd had before difficult missions in the service. Focus, clarity, purpose. The grandfather clock struck 8, reminding him he had 2 hours before meeting Thomas at the bank, just enough time to visit the shop and confirm his growing suspicions about the inventory discrepancies. As John gathered his keys and jacket, a movement caught his eye. A shadow passing behind the rose trellis, too large for neighborhood cats, too deliberate for wind-blown branches. He froze, watching. Nothing moved. Had someone been watching the house? Listening. The question followed him out the door, settling between his shoulder blades like the weight of a rifle he'd once carried in another life. He locked the door with extra care, suddenly certain that more than just his business was at stake. The Harmon Automotive sign caught the morning sun, its weathered blue and white paint a familiar landmark on Main Street for 35 years. John parked his truck in his usual spot, nodding to early customers waiting for the shop to open. His name on the building, his reputation in every repair. The weight of both felt heavier today. "Morning, Mr. Harmon," called Jessie, the young receptionist who reminded John of his granddaughter. You're in early. Everything okay? Just fine, Jesse, he lied, managing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thomas in yet? Not till later. Said he had a meeting at the bank. Her innocent words confirmed what John already knew. Thomas hadn't mentioned anyone accompanying him. John unlocked his office, untouched since yesterday when his world had shifted. The familiar scent of motor oil, leather, and the faint trace of the pine air freshener Martha had always insisted kept the place from smelling like the inside of an engine greeted him. He closed the door behind him, drawing the blinds before turning to the filing cabinet behind his desk. The third drawer, parts inventory and supplier contracts, had a slight resistance John had never noticed before. The folders inside appeared untouched, but when he pulled the Jensen supply file, the paper felt wrong. Newer. He checked the dates on the invoices, comparing them to his notes from last quarter. "Damn it, Thomas," he whispered, discovering entire sections had been replaced with altered versions. The systematic changes would have gone unnoticed in regular operations. 5% here, 8% there, supplier codes subtly changed. Only someone looking for discrepancies would spot the pattern. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Mike stood in the doorway, coffee in hand, face grim. "Found something you should see," the foreman said, closing the door behind him. He set a box on the desk, old, dusty, pulled from some forgotten corner. "Was checking the storage room like you asked. This was hidden behind the winter tires." Inside lay ledgers, a parallel set of books tracking the real inventory, the actual costs, and most damning, notes on which customers were being overcharged and by how much. John's hands shook as he flipped through pages of systematic theft from people who'd trusted him for decades. "Some of these go back 3 years, Mike said quietly. 3 years. Since Martha died. Since John had thrown himself into work during the day and grief at night, leaving more responsibility to his eager nephew. The timeline made his stomach churn. "There's more," Mike continued, pulling a flash drive from his pocket. "Backup systems save these emails. Thomas has been contacting suppliers about establishing a new shop across town, using your customer list, your vendor relationships." John plugged the drive into his computer, watching as evidence of his nephew's betrayal filled the screen. Emails to landlords about commercial properties, messages to key employees about a new opportunity, communications with vendors about transferring accounts. "He's not just stealing from me," John realized aloud, the full scope becoming clear. "He's planning to gut the business from the inside, then start his own with my resources, my reputation." The rage that had been building since last night crystallized into something cold and hard. This wasn't just about money, it was about legacy, about the business he'd built from nothing while raising Thomas after his sister's death, about the name on the building, the trust of the community, the future he'd planned to eventually hand to the very person dismantling it piece by piece. "Does anyone else know about this?" John asked, voice dangerously quiet. Mike shook his head. "Just me and Becky in accounting. She noticed some numbers didn't add up last month, but Thomas told her you'd approved special billing for certain customers. Becky's worked here 15 years. She knows I'd never do that. That's why she came to me yesterday after you left. Said something felt wrong." John closed his eyes briefly, feeling a complex mix of betrayal and gratitude. His nephew had deceived him, but his employees had remained loyal. "I need you to do something for me, Mike," John said, outlining what needed to happen before his bank meeting with Thomas. Mike listened, nodding, face solemn. "You sure about this approach?" the foreman asked when John finished. "Might be easier to just confront him directly, get the police involved." John thought of his sister, Thomas's mother, who'd made him promise to look after her son before she passed. Of Sunday dinners and teaching Thomas to change his first tire at 12, of the pride in watching him graduate, thinking the business would be in good hands someday. "I need to understand why," John said finally. And I need to handle this my way before anyone else gets involved. After Mike left, John called Catherine again, updating her on what they'd found. Her calm voice provided a lifeline of rationality as they refined the plan. Next, he phoned the bank manager, a hunting buddy from way back, and explained what he needed. By the time he hung up, it was nearly 9:30. John sat alone in his office, surrounded by evidence of betrayal, and allowed himself one final moment of grief for what was lost. The relationship with his nephew, the innocent trust in family, the simple joy of the business he'd built. A sharp rap at the door broke his reverie. Becky stood there, her usual efficient demeanor softened with concern. "Mr. Harmon, She hesitated, clutching a folder to her chest. "Mike said you found out about the discrepancies." John gestured for her to enter. "Not your fault, Becky. You tried to raise the alarm. I should have come directly to you." Her voice wavered. "But Thomas said you were dealing with health issues, that we shouldn't bother you with small matters." Tears gathered in her eyes. "I believed him because you seemed so tired after Mrs. Harmon passed. We all thought we were protecting you." The revelation hit John like a physical blow. Thomas had used his grief as a shield, his employees' concern as a weapon. How many others had been manipulated this way? "You have nothing to apologize for," John assured her, standing to place a gentle hand on her shoulder. "But I need your help now." Becky straightened, professional mask sliding back into place. "Anything. I need complete copies of all the real records, everything Thomas might have altered. And I need it without him knowing." She nodded once, decisive. "I've already started. There's something else you should see." She opened her folder, revealing bank statements John had never seen before. "These came to the shop addressed to you, but Thomas always intercepted them. I made copies when I started getting suspicious." The statements showed large transfers from the business account to an LLC John had never heard of, Harmon Holdings. His signature, perfectly forged, authorized each one. "When's the last transfer?" John asked, throat tight. 2 days ago, $50,000, emptying the accounts before making his move, using my name, my reputation, my life's work. Thank you, Becky." John checked his watch. 9:45. "Can you have everything ready by noon? It's already being compiled." A hint of steel showed beneath her professional exterior. "Nobody steals from Harmon Automotive on my watch, sir." As Becky left, John's phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Running late. Meet at bank at 10:30 instead." The delay tactic was transparent now that John knew what to look for. Thomas was buying time, probably making last-minute arrangements. John texted back a simple "okay," then called his bank contact to adjust their timing. When he finally left the office, the shop was busy with morning customers. Mechanics called greetings, unaware of the storm brewing. John paused at the front counter, looking at the waiting area where locals had trusted him with their vehicles for decades. On the wall hung photographs chronicling the shop's history. John as a young man at the grand opening, the staff expansion in the 90s, Thomas's first day as manager, John's arm around his shoulders, both smiling proudly, the last image caught in his throat. When had pride turned to greed in his nephew's heart? When had family become merely a tool for advancement? Outside, John sat in his truck, hands gripping the steering wheel as he gathered himself for what came next. The Thomas he'd raised was still in there somewhere, beneath the deception. The confrontation ahead would determine if anything of their relationship could be salvaged, or if 30 years of family bonds would be sacrificed alongside the business. Either way, John Harmon would not go quietly. Not from the business he'd built with his own hands. Not from the legacy Martha had helped him create. Not from the name on the building that still stood for something in this town. The bank was only 5 minutes away. John started the engine, resolve hardening with each turn of the wheels. In his rearview mirror, Harmon Automotive grew smaller but remained clear, just like the memories of the boy Thomas had been, and the man John had believed him to be. First County Bank's marble columns cast long shadows across the parking lot as John arrived. The building had stood on Main Street since before he was born, outlasting wars, recessions, and the slow transformation of their small town. John had signed the original business loan here 35 years ago, Martha squeezing his hand as the bank officer pushed papers across the polished desk. Today, those memories felt like artifacts from another life. Thomas's sleek BMW occupied a prime spot near the entrance. John parked his weathered truck beside it. American steel next to German engineering, work vehicle beside status symbol. The contrast wasn't lost on him. Inside, the bank's hushed atmosphere wrapped around him like a church. John nodded to the security guard who'd known him for decades. "Morning, Charlie. Thomas Harmon already here?" "In the conference room with Mr. Phillips," Charlie confirmed. "Said you'd be joining them." Of course, Thomas had already started without him. John straightened his shoulders, brushing imaginary dust from his jacket, the same one he wore to Martha's funeral. It felt appropriate somehow. Phillips, the bank manager, rose when John entered. Thomas remained seated, his expression a careful mask of professional concern. "Uncle John," he greeted, the familiar term now sounding hollow. "I was just explaining to David that we need access to the safe deposit box for the business insurance updates." John took the seat across from his nephew rather than beside him. "I appreciate you making time, David," he said to Phillips, ignoring Thomas's statement entirely. "Is everything prepared as we discussed?" Phillips nodded, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Just as you requested, John." Thomas's smile faltered slightly. "Discussed." "I thought this was a routine access." "Nothing routine about today, Thomas." John kept his voice steady, decades of military discipline holding his emotions in check. "David, would you mind giving us the room for a few minutes before we proceed?" The bank manager excused himself, closing the door with a soft click that echoed in the sudden silence. Thomas leaned forward, confidence returning. "Is everything okay, Uncle John? You seem tense." "Do I?" John removed a folder from his jacket, placing it carefully on the table between them. "Tell me about Harmon Holdings, Thomas." The change was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a slight shift in posture. Thomas recovered quickly, smoothing his tie with manicured fingers that had never known the grease and grime of real mechanical work. "It's a holding company I was setting up as a surprise," he replied smoothly, "for tax purposes. I've been working with a financial advisor to protect the business long term. That right?" John opened the folder, revealing bank statements showing transfers of business funds. "And these transfers, 50,000 on Tuesday, 30,000 last month, 22,000 before that, all for tax purposes?" Thomas's expression hardened, calculation replacing concern. "The business is evolving. I've been making strategic investments you wouldn't understand. The market's changing, Uncle John. Small garages like ours are dying. I'm securing our future." "Our future," John repeated, the words tasting bitter. "Like the parallel books you've been keeping, the overcharged customers, the suppliers you've been contacting about your new garage across town?" Thomas flinched, genuine surprise crossing his features before control returned. "You've been going through my things, spying on me?" "No, son." "Your own paper trail did you in." John felt a curious calm descend, the kind he'd experienced in combat when everything narrowed to what needed to be done. "Mike found your real ledgers hidden in the storage room. Becky kept copies of the bank statements you intercepted. Your own employees brought me the evidence." A flush spread across Thomas's face. "They had no right. Those were private business documents." "Harmon Automotive is my business," John said quietly. my name, my life's work. A business you've let stagnate. Thomas's composure cracked, revealing the ambition beneath. We could be a regional chain by now if you weren't stuck in the past, fixing cars like it's still 1985. I've been dragging this place into the modern era while you reminisce about the good old days. Each word landed like a physical blow. John absorbed them silently, searching his nephew's face for any trace of the boy he'd raised, the young man who'd once worked alongside him with genuine passion for the craft. So, you decided to steal from me, from our customers, from people who've trusted us for decades? Thomas scoffed. I've been running that shop since Aunt Martha died and you checked out. 3 years, Uncle John. 3 years of watching you go through the motions while I built something that could actually survive. The mention of Martha sent a cold surge through John's chest. Don't you dare use her name to justify what you've done. Someone had to be practical. She understood business better than you ever did. Why do you think she made me manager in the first place? The accusation hung in the air between them. John closed his eyes briefly, remembering Martha's insistence that Thomas needed more responsibility, more trust. Had she seen something even then? Or had she, like John, been blind to the ambition festering beneath Thomas's dedicated exterior? When John opened his eyes, he found no answers in his nephew's defiant gaze, only the reflection of his own failure to see what had been happening right in front of him. I trusted you, John said simply. I loved you like a son. Something flickered across Thomas's face. Regret, perhaps, or just calculation. I did what was necessary. You weren't strong enough to make the hard decisions anymore. Strong enough? John's voice remained quiet, but iron crept into his tone. I built this business with my bare hands when you were still in diapers. I worked 16-hour days while raising you after your mother died. I put you through college when I could barely afford the shop's rent. And I've paid that back 1,000 times over. Thomas slammed his hand on the table. Who modernized the accounting system? Who brought in the fleet servicing contracts? Who manages the day-to-day while you reminisce with old customers about carburetors and distributor caps? You did those things because I trusted you with my life's work, John replied steadily. Not so you could steal it from under me. Thomas's laugh held no humor. Steal? I was saving it. Another 5 years of your outdated management, and there'd be nothing left to steal. The words hung between them like smoke, revealing the depth of the chasm that had formed without John noticing. Not just a betrayal of trust, but a fundamental difference in values. What the business meant, what success looked like, what family stood for. John suddenly felt every one of his 68 years. The weight of Martha's absence, the strain of maintaining the business alone, the slow erosion of his relationship with Thomas, all of it pressed down on his shoulders until he thought he might break under the pressure. What are you going to do? Thomas finally asked, his voice smaller now. Call the police? Have your own nephew arrested? Think about what that would do to the business reputation you're so proud of. The calculated appeal to his pride might have worked yesterday. Today, John saw it for the manipulation it was. I already have done something, John replied, checking his watch. While we've been talking, Mike and Becky have been gathering every document, every record of what you've done. Catherine Walsh is at the shop now, reviewing everything with the forensic accountant she brought. Thomas paled. You can't. I've also frozen all the business accounts, including your precious Harmon holdings. David's been very helpful this morning. You're making a mistake, Thomas hissed, desperation edging into his voice. I was going to offer you a generous retirement package, a consulting position. You could have eased out with dignity. Eased out, like an old part no longer useful. The final piece clicked into place for John, not just theft, not just deception, but a complete plan to push him out of his own business. The realization should have crushed him. Instead, It freed something inside his chest. I may be old, Thomas, but I'm not finished. John stood, gathering his folder. David will be escorting you to the safe deposit box now, not for your fabricated insurance documents, but so I can remove the original business deed and articles of incorporation. After that, you have until closing time to clear out your office. You can't fire me. I'm family. Thomas's confident facade crumbled completely. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do? For the first time since discovering the betrayal, John felt genuine sadness pierce through his anger. That's not my concern anymore. You made your choice when you decided family meant nothing. John turned to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing. Martha knew. Thomas froze. What? She suspected you might do something like this eventually. That's why she insisted on those contingency plans I activated this morning. She saw what I couldn't, or wouldn't, see. The shock on Thomas's face was the first genuine emotion John had seen from him. It offered no satisfaction, only confirmation of how completely John had failed to see the truth about the boy he'd raised. As he walked out into the sunlight, John felt a curious emptiness. The confrontation was over, but the wound remained, raw and pulsing with each heartbeat. He sat in his truck, hands gripping the steering wheel, and finally allowed the tears to come. Not for the business, that could be rebuilt, not for the money, that could be recovered, but for the family bond that had been severed as cleanly as if cut with a blade, leaving nothing but phantom pain where love had once resided. Has betrayal by family ever left you feeling this helpless? Share your experience in the comments, like if John's heartbreak mirrors your own, and follow to see how decades of wisdom become his most powerful weapon against those who underestimated him. The shop was unnaturally quiet when John returned. Mechanics worked with subdued focus, conversations hushed, glances following him as he made his way through the service bay. News traveled fast in small businesses. Everyone knew something had happened, even if they didn't know exactly what. Catherine Walsh waited in his office, sleek and professional in her charcoal suit, a stark contrast to the utilitarian space with its decades-old desk and walls lined with certification plaques and fading photographs. Beside her sat a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, laptop open before him. "John," Catherine greeted him, warm professionalism in her voice. They'd known each other since high school, long before she became the most respected attorney in 3 counties. "This is Daniel Hoffman, the forensic accountant I mentioned." John shook the man's hand, noting the firm grip despite the scholarly appearance. "Appreciate you coming on short notice. Not often I get to work a case where the evidence is so meticulously documented," Hoffman replied. "Your employees have been extremely helpful." "What have you found?" John asked, lowering himself into his chair, suddenly aware of the bone-deep exhaustion threatening to overtake him. Catherine and Hoffman exchanged glances before she spoke. "It's extensive, John. The financial diversion, the forged documents, the customer overcharging. It's been systematic and deliberate. Thomas covered his tracks well, but not well enough." "And the legal implications?" "Multiple felony counts," she said bluntly. "Fraud, embezzlement, forgery. We're talking potential prison time if you press charges." The words hung in the air. Thomas in prison. His sister's boy behind bars. Despite everything, the thought made John's stomach twist. "There are alternatives," Catherine continued, reading his expression. "Civil remedies, financial restitution, legal agreements that keep him out of jail but protect your business." John nodded slowly, grateful for options he wasn't ready to consider yet. "And the business? How bad is the damage?" Hoffman adjusted his glasses. "Financially speaking, you can recover. The diverted funds are substantial, approximately $217,000 over 3 years, but with the accounts frozen, we should be able to reclaim most of it. The bigger challenge will be customer relationships. Some have been significantly overcharged." I need a complete list, John said immediately. Everyone who was overcharged gets a full refund and their next service free. I don't care what it costs. Catherine made a note. That's a good start for customer relations. What about staffing? Thomas was handling significant operational responsibilities. The question brought John up short. For 3 decades, he'd been hands-on with every aspect of the business. The past 3 years, he'd gradually withdrawn, leaving more to Thomas while he processed his grief. Now, he faced a stark choice. Step fully back into the role of owner-operator or find someone new to trust. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mike stood there with Becky and Jesse from reception. Sorry to interrupt, Mike said, though his expression suggested the opposite. We've been talking, and we'd like a few minutes when you're done here. We're just about finished, Catherine replied, gathering her papers. Daniel and I need to make some calls anyway. We'll update you this afternoon, John. When they'd gone, his 3 employees entered, an air of determination about them. We want you to know, Becky began without preamble, that we're behind you 100%. All of us are. The whole staff met during lunch, Mike continued. Everyone's staying. Nobody's following Thomas, no matter what he offers. John felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of worry he hadn't acknowledged until now. I appreciate that more than I can say. Jesse stepped forward, uncharacteristically serious. It's more than that, Mr. Harmon. We've worked out a temporary management structure to cover everything Thomas was handling. She handed him a neatly typed organizational chart. John scanned it, surprise growing as he recognized the careful thought behind it. Mike would oversee operations and staff scheduling. Becky would handle finances and supplier relationships. Jesse would manage customer communications and the new computer system Thomas had installed. You've thought this through, John said, genuinely impressed. We've been discussing contingency plans for weeks, Becky admitted. Several of us had suspicions, but we needed evidence before coming to you. Why now? John asked, the question that had haunted him since yesterday. Why did everyone start noticing at once? The 3 exchanged glances before Mike answered. It was Mrs. Rodriguez's bill last month, 87 years old, living on Social Security, comes in for a simple oil change. Thomas charged her for a full transmission service she never received. When she questioned it, he told her you had approved the senior pricing structure. John's hands clenched involuntarily. Elena Rodriguez had been one of his first customers, her late husband one of John's few friends when he'd started the business. Jesse reversed the charge immediately, Mike continued, but it was the pattern we finally couldn't ignore. He was targeting people least likely to check their bills, seniors, single women, people who trusted the Harmon name. The betrayal of trust cut deeper than the financial theft. John had built his reputation on fairness and honesty. The thought of his name being used to exploit vulnerable customers made his blood boil. We should have come to you sooner, Becky said, regret evident in her voice. You thought I was too fragile after Martha. John finished for her. Thomas told you I was struggling, that I needed to be protected from problems. Their uncomfortable silence confirmed his suspicion. Well, I'm not fragile now, John said, rising from his chair with new energy. And we have work to do. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. John moved through the shop, speaking with each employee, reassuring worried customers, examining the changes Thomas had implemented over the years. Some were genuine improvements. The computerized scheduling system, the expanded service bay. Others revealed the systematic dismantling of the business culture John had built, replacing quality with expediency, relationship with profit. By closing time, John had a clearer picture of both the damage and the path forward. He stood in the empty service bay, the familiar smells of oil and rubber comforting after the emotional turmoil of the past 2 days. Penny for your thoughts, came a voice from behind him. John turned to find Catherine, jacket removed, sleeves rolled up, looking more like the girl he'd known in high school than the polished attorney who'd arrived that morning. "Not sure they're worth that much," he replied with a tired smile. "I've been reviewing everything with Daniel," she said, moving to stand beside him. "Legally, you're in a strong position. The evidence is overwhelming." "And Thomas?" Catherine sighed. "He's hired Gerald Michaels." "Fastest shark in the water," John nodded, unsurprised. Michaels had a reputation for aggressive tactics and moral flexibility. "He's already fishing for a settlement. Says Thomas will relinquish all claims to the business in exchange for dropping any criminal charges and a fair compensation package for his years of service." John barked a laugh entirely devoid of humor. "Compensation for stealing from me and my customers." "It's just an opening position," Catherine assured him. "We don't have to respond yet." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, surrounded by the tools and equipment of the trade John had practiced for most of his life. "Martha would know what to do," John said finally, voicing the thought that had circled his mind all day. "She always saw things clearer than I did." "She was remarkable," Catherine agreed. "But she also believed in you completely, John. Even at the end, when she was setting up those contingency plans, she told me, 'John will know what to do when the time comes. He just needs to remember who he is.'" The words struck him with physical force. Remember who he is, not the grieving widower. Not the aging mechanic, but the Marine who never left a man behind, the business owner who built something from nothing, the man Martha had loved for his integrity as much as his strength. "I know what I need to do," John said, clarity suddenly breaking through the fog of betrayal and hurt. "But I'll need your help." "You've got it," Catherine replied without hesitation. "What's the plan?" As John outlined his thoughts, he felt something he hadn't experienced since finding that first forged document. Purpose. Not just anger or righteous indignation, but a clear vision of the path forward. By the time they finished talking, the sky outside had darkened to deep blue. Catherine gathered her things, promising to return in the morning with the necessary paperwork. "You know," she said at the door, "Martha would be proud of how you're handling this." After she left, John walked through the quiet shop, turning off lights, checking locks, the closing ritual he'd performed thousands of times over decades. At each station, memories surfaced, teaching Thomas to use the diagnostic equipment, celebrating with the staff when they landed their first fleet contract, Martha bringing lunch during those early lean years when they couldn't afford to close even for an hour. In the front office, he paused before the wall of photographs chronicling the business's history. Among them hung a faded picture from opening day, John and Martha standing proudly before the newly painted Harmon Automotive sign, young and terrified and exhilarated all at once. John gently removed the photo from the wall, wiping a thin layer of dust from the glass with his handkerchief. Martha's smile beamed back at him, confident and loving. "I remember who I am," he whispered to her image. "And I know what needs to be done." For the first time since the betrayal, John felt the heavy weight on his chest begin to lift. The path ahead would be difficult, but he would walk it with the strength and integrity that had defined his life before grief had temporarily dimmed his vision. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Tonight, in the quiet of his shop with Martha's smile watching over him, John Harmon found his resolve again. Morning light filtered through the blinds as John reviewed the documents Catherine had prepared. The legal language was dense, but the essence was clear. 2 paths forward, each with its own consequences. Option 1 is aggressive, Catherine explained, tapping the first folder. "We press criminal charges, pursue full financial restitution, and make a public statement about the fraud to protect the Harmon automotive reputation. Thomas likely faces jail time." John's stomach tightened at the thought of his nephew in prison. Despite everything, the image was difficult to bear. "Option 2, she continued, opening the second folder, is the settlement approach. Thomas surrenders all claim to the business, returns accessible funds, signs a non-compete agreement, and we handle customer restitution quietly. No criminal charges, but he walks away with nothing except his freedom. And his dignity, John added quietly. Catherine's expression softened. That too, yes. Though some would argue he forfeited that already. John stood, moving to the window that overlooked the shop floor. Below, mechanics were already at work, the rhythm of the business continuing despite the earthquake that had shaken its foundation. Mike was showing a new apprentice how to properly diagnose an electrical issue, his patience evident even from a distance. "What would you do?" John asked, not turning around. Catherine's reflection appeared beside his in the window glass. "As your attorney, I'd recommend option 1. It protects you legally and financially, creates a clear public record of what happened, and provides the strongest deterrent against future problems. And as my friend," she sighed, "as someone who's known you both for decades, I think you need to decide what you can live with, John. What lets you look in the mirror tomorrow and recognize the man looking back? Has betrayal by family ever left you feeling this torn? Comment your story below, like if you've faced this impossible choice, and follow to see how John's wisdom guides his most difficult decision." John thought of Thomas as a boy, skinned knees and eager eyes, following him around the shop. The proud young man at his college graduation, the nephew who had held John's hand at Martha's funeral when grief had threatened to drown him. He also thought of Elena Rodriguez being overcharged on her fixed income, of the employees who had been manipulated and lied to, of the systematic betrayal that had unfolded over years while he had been blinded by trust and grief. "There's a third option," John said finally, turning to face Catherine. "One that holds him accountable without destroying him completely." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." John outlined his thoughts, a hybrid approach that required Thomas to make full financial restitution, publicly apologize to staff and overcharged customers, and surrender all claims to the business. In exchange, John would not press criminal charges, but Thomas would need to complete community service hours at the senior center, where many of Harman Automotive's longest-standing customers resided. "Redemption with accountability," Catherine said when he finished. "It's unorthodox, but it could work. Thomas might not agree, though." "Then he chooses option 1, John replied, a steely edge to his voice. "This isn't mercy without justice. It's offering a path back to the man I hoped he would become." Catherine nodded slowly. "I'll draw up the papers. When do you want to present this to him?" John checked his watch. The bank would be opening soon, and with it, the next chapter in this painful story. "Today," he said firmly. "It's time to finish this and start rebuilding." As Catherine gathered her papers, John felt the weight of his decision settle across his shoulders, not crushing him, but steadying him like the familiar weight of responsibility he'd carried all his life. The conference room at First County Bank felt smaller than it had 3 days ago. Thomas sat across the table, his lawyer Gerald Michaels beside him, all expensive suit and predatory alertness. John took his seat slowly, Catherine arranging documents with practiced precision. "Let's skip the pleasantries," Michaels began, his voice cultured and cold. "My client is prepared to relinquish claims to Harman Automotive in exchange for fair compensation and mutual non-disclosure agreements." Catherine's smile didn't reach her eyes. "That's generous, considering the evidence we've compiled." She slid a folder across the table. $217,000 in embezzled funds, 42 instances of forgery, 67 customers systematically overcharged. Michaels glanced at the documents, his expression unchanged. Allegations that would be costly and time-consuming to prove in court, potentially destroying the business's reputation in the process. Surely not what Mr. Harman wants. Throughout the exchange, Thomas remained silent, eyes fixed on the table. John studied his nephew, the slumped shoulders, the hollowed expression, the defeated posture so different from his usual confidence. For the first time, John wondered if Thomas had been sleeping as poorly as he had since the confrontation. "I'd like to speak with my nephew alone," John said suddenly. Both lawyers began to object simultaneously. "Just 5 minutes," John continued. "After 30 years, I think we're owed that much." Michaels looked to Thomas, who nodded slightly. 5 minutes, the lawyer agreed reluctantly. "But I advise my client not to discuss specifics of the case." When the lawyers had stepped outside, silence filled the room like a physical presence. The ticking wall clock, the same one John remembered from signing his original business loan, counted off seconds that stretched into eternity. "Why?" John finally asked, the single word containing all the hurt, confusion, and betrayal of the past days. Thomas flinched as if struck. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed. "I don't have a good answer. Try anyway." Thomas exhaled shakily. "It started small. After Aunt Martha died, you were absent. Even when you were physically there, you weren't really present. The business needed decisions. I made them. Decisions like stealing from our customers." John's voice remained level, though it cost him. "No, that came later." Thomas ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "At first, I was just keeping things running. Then I started making improvements, real ones. The new computer system, the fleet contracts. But you barely noticed." John acknowledged the truth in this with a slight nod. Grief had hollowed him out, leaving little room for recognition or praise. "I think I got resentful," Thomas continued. "I was doing all the work, making all the decisions, but it was still your name on the building, your business, your legacy." His voice cracked on the last word. "And then one day, I made a small adjustment to the books, just to see if you'd notice." "But I didn't," John said quietly. "No. And it got easier each time. Then it became, I don't know, a game? A test? A way to build my own future since it seemed like you'd checked out of yours?" Thomas met John's eyes directly for the first time. "I'm not justifying it. I can't. What I did was wrong. All of it." The simple admission hung in the air between them, unexpected and unadorned with excuses. "I never meant it to go this far," Thomas added, almost whispering. "I just couldn't seem to stop once it started." John studied the man across from him, not the confident, calculating betrayer of their last encounter, but something more complex. A nephew he'd raised, a partner he'd trusted, a man who had lost his way. "I have a proposition for you," John said finally. "Not from our lawyers, from me to you." Thomas straightened slightly, wariness and hope battling in his expression. "I'm listening." John leaned forward, hands clasped on the table between them. "It won't be easy. And it starts with looking Elena Rodriguez in the eye and explaining why you charged her for work that was never done." The color drained from Thomas's face, but he didn't look away. Outside the conference room, the lawyers' muffled voices rose in debate, but inside, uncle and nephew had found something neither had expected in this sterile bank room, a fragile moment of truth between the ruins of trust. 6 months later, John stood in the morning sunshine outside Harmon Automotive, watching as the new sign was installed above the entrance. The familiar blue and white remained, but beneath the main logo, fresh lettering read, "Quality Service, since 1985, Community Owned." "Looks good," Mike commented, coffee mug in hand as he joined John on the sidewalk. "Different, but good." "That it does," John agreed, satisfaction warming his voice. The transition hadn't been easy. After that day at the bank, Thomas had accepted John's alternative proposal: full financial restitution, public apologies to staff and customers, 500 hours of community service at the senior center, and perhaps hardest of all, personal visits to each overcharged customer to explain what he had done and make amends. In exchange, John hadn't pressed criminal charges. But Thomas had no place in the business anymore. That bridge had burned beyond repair. Instead, John had implemented a plan that had been forming since that night in his office, staring at Martha's photograph. Harmon Automotive would become employee-owned, with John maintaining a controlling interest during the 5-year transition period before his full retirement. Mike, Becky, and the other long-term employees who had remained loyal would become partners in the business they had helped build. First management meeting as official partners this afternoon, Mike reminded him, a hint of nervousness in his voice. Becky's been practicing her financial presentation all week. John smiled. She'll do fine. You all will. Inside, the shop hummed with morning activity. John moved through the space that had been his life's work, exchanging greetings with mechanics and front desk staff. The atmosphere had changed since Thomas's departure, lighter somehow, more collaborative, with a renewed sense of purpose that reminded John of the early days. In his office, soon to be the partners' conference room once the renovation was completed, John found Elena Rodriguez waiting, elegant at 87 in her church clothes. "John Harmon, you keep an old woman waiting," she scolded good-naturedly, rising to accept his hug. "Meeting ran long at the senior center," John apologized. "The new computer class is popular." "Those classes were your idea, yes?" Elena settled back into her chair. "Thomas said so when he was helping last week." John nodded, still adjusting to the strange reality where his nephew spent weekends teaching basic computer skills to seniors as part of his community service. Thomas approached the task with unexpected dedication, his natural charm gradually rebuilding some of the trust he had broken. "He's changed," Elena observed, sharp eyes missing nothing. "Not completely, perhaps, but enough that I believe he means his apologies now." "I think so too," John agreed cautiously. The road to redemption was long, and Thomas had only taken the first steps. Whether he would complete the journey remained to be seen. Elena patted his hand. "You did right by him, even when he didn't deserve it. Martha would be proud." The mention of his late wife sent the familiar pang through John's chest, but lately the pain came with warmth too, the comfort of knowing she would indeed approve of the choices he had made. After Elena left, John took a moment alone in his office. The wall of photographs had been rearranged, new images added, the employee ownership signing ceremony, the customer appreciation day they'd held to rebuild community trust, the expanded apprenticeship program with the local technical college. John touched the original photo of himself and Martha on opening day, now restored to prominence. "We did it, darling," he murmured. "It's going to outlast both of us now." Outside his office, a new generation of mechanics and managers were taking up the mantle of the business they now partially owned. John Harmon's legacy wouldn't be defined by his nephew's betrayal, but by the community of trust he had built and rebuilt when that trust was broken. As he joined his partners for their first official meeting, John carried the weight of the past 6 months, the betrayal, the hurt, the difficult choices, not as a burden, but as hard-won wisdom. At 68, he had learned that legacy wasn't just what you built, but how you rebuilt when life tore it down. The business would continue, different, but stronger for having weathered the storm, just like John himself. Folks, we've all sat at that kitchen table at some point, hands trembling around a piece of paper that changed everything. Maybe it wasn't a forged document like John found, but we know that feeling, that moment when trust shatters and the floor seems to drop away beneath you. When someone you've loved and believed in shows you a face you never thought they wore, those silent tears that fall when no one's watching carry the weight of years and memories suddenly called into question. You've been there, haven't you? That crushing moment when betrayal wrings the breath from your chest. When you wonder if everything you've built over decades might crumble beneath the weight of someone else's deception. The world looks different then. That familiar chair feels less supportive. The tick of the clock sounds louder. Even the coffee tastes bitter with the salt of unexpected tears. We ain't meant to face such things in our golden years, are we, darlin'? But face them we do, because life doesn't check our age before dealing its hardest blows. What John discovered, what perhaps you've learned too, is that wisdom earned through decades isn't easily defeated. Those weathered hands that built a business, raised a child, weathered storms both literal and figurative, still remember how to close into fists when needed. The eyes that have seen wars and weddings, births and burials, can still distinguish truth from lies when we clear away the tears. Our hearts may crack, but they've been mended before. They remember how. That's the gift of our years. Not just the pain of what we've lost, but the strength of what we've survived. The porch swing might creak a little louder these days. The garden may need more tending than it used to, but there's something powerful in sitting there at dusk, watching shadows lengthen, knowing you've faced betrayal and remained standing. Your legacy isn't in what others try to take from you. It's in what they can never touch. Your dignity, your resilience, your capacity to begin again, even when beginning feels impossible. So rock in that swing a while. Let the stars remind you how small our troubles are in the grand scheme. Then wipe those eyes, straighten those shoulders, and show the world what strength looks like when it's been tempered by tears.